Some stories were buried and not forgotten. Some warnings were heard, but ignored. And some truths still echo in silence. This is Pale Frequency. What if the worst disaster in NASA history was not just an accident? What if the people who built the rocket had already warned, in writing, in signed documents, that something could go wrong? What if, the night before 7 people climbed into that spacecraft, engineers sat in a room and urged NASA not to launch, and NASA launched anyway? This is not a conspiracy theory. Everything you are about to hear is documented. The memos exist. The phone call exists. The signatures exist. The people who tried to stop it exist and spent the rest of their lives living with what they could not prevent. This is the story of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. But it is not the version most people remember. It is the story of what happened the night before. If you have never been here before, this channel exists for exactly this. The stories that were documented, but never fully told. The signals that were sent and ignored. If that is something you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is there. Takes 1 second. It means the next transmission reaches you. Now, stay with this one. Because what happened on the night of January 27th, 1986, the hours before the launch, is the part most people have never heard in full. And once you hear it, you will not be able to unhear it. 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the temperature at Kennedy Space Center on the morning of January 28th, 1986. To understand why that number matters, you need to understand something about rubber. At low temperatures, rubber loses its ability to compress and seal. It stiffens. It becomes rigid. It stops doing the one thing it was designed to do. The Space Shuttle's solid rocket boosters were sealed by rubber O-rings, thick circular gaskets fitted into joints along the length of each booster. Their job was simple and absolute: to prevent superheated gases from escaping during launch. At normal temperatures, they worked. But on that morning, the shuttle sat in conditions far colder than any previous launch in the program's history. The coldest prior launch had been around 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and even then, there had been signs of O-ring erosion. Engineers had seen that data. They had written about it, and they had been concerned for months. But on January 28, 1986, it was 28 degrees, and there was ice on the launch pad. Maintenance crews documented it during overnight inspections. Ice on the gantry, ice on the external tank, ice forming along the fixed service structure. A NASA inspection team walked the pad at first light. They recorded the conditions. They filed the observations. The countdown continued. 7 people were preparing to board a spacecraft sitting in temperatures no shuttle had ever truly been tested in. Temperatures that engineers, the people who built the system, had warned were dangerous. Temperatures that would prove to be exactly as critical as they feared. But those engineers had been overruled the night before. And to understand how that happened, you have to go back 6 months. July 31st, 1985. 6 months before the launch. Summer in Utah, where Morton Thiokol had its engineering facilities. A senior engineer named Roger Boisjoli sat at his desk and wrote a memo. Roger Boisjoli was not a man who panicked. He had spent years in aerospace engineering. He understood risk. He understood that all complex systems carry margins of uncertainty, and that the job of an engineer is to quantify those margins as precisely as possible, and communicate them clearly to the people responsible for decisions. He was doing his job on July 31st, 1985. The memo was addressed to R.K. Lund, Morton Thiokol's Vice President of Engineering. It was detailed, technical, and precise. It documented the erosion patterns that had been observed on O-rings from previous shuttle flights. It traced the relationship between temperature and O-ring performance. It described what the data suggested could happen if the program continued launching without addressing the seal design. And then it reached its conclusion. Boisjoli wrote that the result of this could be a catastrophe of the highest order, including loss of human life. He wrote that the O-ring erosion problem was not a maintenance issue or a minor anomaly. He described it as a critical design concern. He warned that the condition represented a serious risk, and he wrote that he sincerely hoped the issue would be resolved before it was too late. But he stated clearly that if it was not addressed, it was only a matter of time before a flight experienced a seal failure during launch. He signed the memo. He submitted it. It was received by R.K. Lund on August 9, 1985. It was filed. No immediate corrective redesign was implemented on the O-ring system. The shuttle program continued flying. There were more launches in the second half of 1985. Each one carried known risk that engineers had been actively discussing. Each one returned safely. Each successful flight seemed to reinforce the decision to continue, seemed to suggest that perhaps the concerns were overstated, that the margins were larger than the data indicated. They were not larger than the data indicated. The data was consistent. The risk was real. The flights had simply not yet encountered the conditions that would expose it. January 28th would be different. But before we get to the launch, we have to get to the night before. Because the night before is where this story becomes something more than a technical failure. The night before is where human beings, in real time, tried to prevent what was about to happen, and were overruled. 7:15 p.m., January 27, 1986, Kennedy Space Center, Marshall Space Flight Center, Morton Thiokol facilities in Utah. 3 locations, 1 telephone conference line, a conversation that would help determine whether 7 people lived or died. The conference had been called because of the overnight temperature forecast. Meteorologists had confirmed that temperatures at Kennedy Space Center would drop below freezing before dawn. Engineers at Thiokol had been tracking the forecast, and the concern was immediate. The O-rings would be cold, colder than any previous launch condition, cold in a way the data suggested was dangerous, cold in a way that had not been fully tested in flight. The Thiokol engineers presented their case. Roger Boisjoli was there, Alan MacDonald was there. A team of engineers who had spent months analyzing O-ring performance were there, and they laid out everything they knew, methodically and clearly, to the NASA managers on the other end of the line. The data indicated increased risk at lower temperatures. Previous launches had shown O-ring erosion at temperatures as high as 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The overnight temperature was forecast to drop significantly lower, with launch conditions expected to be far outside prior experience. This was not a routine condition. This was not a scenario supported by existing flight data. The engineers were not presenting a preference. They were expressing a concern that the system was being asked to operate beyond its demonstrated limits, and that the risk of seal failure was serious. The NASA managers pushed back. The pushback was not aligned with the engineers' interpretation of the data. There was disagreement about how conclusive the data was, and whether it justified a launch constraint. What was also present was pressure. Schedule pressure, program pressure, the weight of repeated delays, and the expectation to proceed. One manager, Lawrence Malloy, from NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, said words that the engineers present would remember for the rest of their lives. He said he was appalled. He said he was appalled that Thiokol was attempting to establish a new launch constraint on the eve of launch. He argued that the data was inconclusive. He questioned whether the engineers had sufficient evidence to justify a no-launch recommendation, shifting the discussion toward proof and certainty under conditions where uncertainty itself was the concern. And then he said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch?" "Next April." That sentence, that one sentence, it was not simply a question. It reflected frustration. It reflected the tension between engineering caution and program expectations. It reflected how the decision environment was shifting. The Thiokol engineers heard it. They understood the implications. The question now was what their management would do next. Morton Thiokol management asked NASA for a 5-minute caucus off the line. The caucus lasted approximately 30 minutes. In that room, off the phone, away from the NASA managers, Roger Boisjoli and Arnold Thompson continued arguing their case. They presented the data again. They described the temperature relationships again. They repeated what they had been saying for months, and what they had said for the previous hours. The O-rings had not been demonstrated to perform reliably at the forecast temperatures. The risk was real. The launch should not proceed. The senior Thiokol managers listened, and then one of them, Gerald Mason, senior vice president, said something that has since become one of the most widely cited statements associated with the decision process. He said, "I want you to take off your engineering hats and put on your management hats. Take off your engineering hats. Put on your management hats. Consider what is being asked in that sentence." The engineers in that room had been brought there for their technical judgment. Their role in that moment was to interpret data, assess risk, and communicate their conclusions clearly. The statement implied a shift from a purely technical assessment toward a broader programmatic decision, one that included schedule, commitments, and organizational pressure alongside engineering concerns. A management decision, which, in context, meant weighing the consequences of delay against the uncertainty in the data. Roger Boisjoli made one final attempt. He referred to evidence from previous flights, including documented O-ring erosion observed after launches in colder conditions. Physical evidence. Recorded data. He placed that evidence directly in front of the managers. He later described the experience as feeling unheard. The managers moved toward a decision. It was not unanimous, but a recommendation was produced. Gerald Mason supported it. Robert Lund supported it. The initial engineering recommendation to not launch was reversed at the management level. The final document reflected a decision to proceed. The document was transmitted to NASA at approximately 11 p.m. It was a formal written recommendation from Morton Thiokol stating that the launch could proceed the following morning. NASA received the recommendation. The launch moved forward. Roger Boisjoli went home that night aware of the risk as he understood it. He later described lying awake, going through the data again. Not because he believed he had made an error, but because there was nothing left to change. The decision had been made. It was no longer in his control. He had written the memo. He had argued the case. He had presented the data. The final decision had gone in a different direction. Dawn came cold to Kennedy Space Center. The ice inspection team conducted a final check at approximately 1:30 a.m. and identified conditions that, by any reasonable standard, should have prompted serious concern. Ice had formed in the water troughs. Ice was present on the hold-down bolts of the launch platform. Ice had also been observed along the right side of the external tank, in the region near the solid rocket booster field joints. These conditions were documented. They were photographed. They were reported. The countdown continued. Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, the first civilian selected to fly on the shuttle, and the reason millions of American schoolchildren were watching live that morning, had breakfast in crew quarters and prepared for the day. She had trained for months. She understood the shuttle systems at the level required for her role. She had been informed that the vehicle was safe to fly. She had been told the situation as it was understood within NASA management. She had not been exposed to the specific engineering concerns raised by Roger Boisjoli. None of the crew had been. Francis Scobie, the commander, Michael Smith, the pilot, Ronald McNair, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis. 7 individuals who had committed years of their lives to the program, who trusted the institution that had selected them, trained them, and placed them aboard the vehicle. They suited up. They walked out into the cold. They boarded the spacecraft. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, the main engines ignited. The solid rocket boosters ignited. Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Launch Complex 39B. In the viewing area, Roger Boisjoli was watching. He hoped, as he would later describe, with an intensity he had never experienced before, hoping that he was wrong, hoping that the data was incomplete, hoping that the cold had not affected the O-rings in the way the physics suggested it would. For 40 seconds, Challenger ascended normally. For 60 seconds, it continued ascending normally. At 73 seconds, the right solid rocket booster experienced a catastrophic failure at the lower field joint. The O-ring, the rubber seal that Boisjoli had written about in July, that engineers had debated the night before, and that analysis had shown to be vulnerable in low temperatures, did not seal as intended in approximately 28-degree Fahrenheit conditions. Hot combustion gases began leaking through the joint shortly after ignition. A plume of flame impinged on the external tank structure and the aft attachment strut, progressively weakening the structural connection between the booster and the tank. At 73 seconds, that connection failed. The external tank disintegrated. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen rapidly mixed and ignited. The vehicle was engulfed in a fireball and, almost simultaneously, broke apart under extreme aerodynamic forces at an altitude of approximately 46,000 feet. The crew cabin remained structurally intact during the initial breakup. This is the part that is difficult to confront. The crew cabin did not disintegrate immediately. It separated from the rest of the vehicle and continued on a ballistic trajectory for several seconds before beginning its descent toward the Atlantic Ocean. Investigators later determined that at least 3 personal emergency air packs had been manually activated after the breakup sequence had begun. This indicates that some crew members were alive for a brief period following the disintegration of the vehicle. The cabin impacted the ocean at an estimated speed of approximately 200 miles per hour. On television screens across the United States, in classrooms where students had gathered to watch Krista McAuliffe, the white contrail separated into branching plumes against the blue January sky. At first, there was confusion, then recognition, then silence. In the viewing area, Roger Boisjoli watched the plume divide. He understood immediately what had occurred. He understood because he had considered the possibility for months. He understood because he had attempted to prevent it. He understood because the data he had been carrying since July had, in that moment, been confirmed in the most irreversible way possible. He said nothing. He stood very still. The Rogers Commission was convened by Ronald Reagan within days of the disaster. 14 members, including former astronauts, scientists, and military officials. Their mandate was to determine the cause of the accident and to recommend measures that would prevent such a failure from happening again. Richard Feynman was among them, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, a man who had spent his career resistant to institutional obfuscation and deeply skeptical of official explanations that failed to align with physical reality. He became frustrated with the commission process almost immediately. In Feynman's view, NASA's presentation of the O-ring data appeared carefully structured to obscure rather than clarify. Probabilities were cited that did not align with the historical engineering record. The chain of decisions leading to launch was described in language that diffused responsibility rather than identifying it. The process was producing an official explanation, and Feynman did not believe it was the true one. So he did what physicists do. He reduced the problem to its simplest, most demonstrable form. He obtained a piece of O-ring material. He brought a glass of ice water to a public session of the commission. In front of cameras, in front of NASA officials, and in front of the country, he placed the O-ring material into the ice water and compressed it with a small clamp. He held it there briefly. Then he removed it and demonstrated that the material had lost its resilience, that it no longer returned to its original shape after the compression was released, that, when exposed to cold, it behaved exactly as the Thiokol engineers had warned it would under near-freezing launch conditions. It took a glass of ice water, a piece of rubber, and a few minutes to demonstrate what Roger Boisterly had been attempting to communicate for 6 months. The room understood. Feynman's appendix to the Commission's final report was a document of unusual clarity and unusual courage. The Commission's leadership initially attempted to exclude it. They considered it too critical of NASA management. Feynman was informed that the appendix would not be included. He responded that if the appendix were removed, he would withdraw his name from the report entirely. The appendix was included. It concluded with a sentence that has outlasted the Commission, outlasted the careers of those involved, and endured beyond nearly everything connected to the disaster itself. Feynman wrote, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. Nature cannot be fooled, not by schedules, not by management decisions, not by institutional pressure to maintain momentum and public confidence, not by assurances that everything is nominal when the data indicates otherwise. Nature cannot be fooled," and on January 28, 1986, proved it. Roger Boisterly testified before the Rogers Commission in February 1986. He brought his memos, he described the phone call, he described the caucus, he described the moment when Morton Thiokol management told the engineers to put on their management hats. He described pushing the photographs across the table and watching them be disregarded. He told the truth completely and precisely, in the same way he had written the memo and argued on the telephone, with the clarity of someone who had done everything correctly and been overruled by forces that had nothing to do with the data. When he returned to Morton Thiokol after testifying, the company's response was swift and quiet. His security clearance was revoked, his access to ongoing projects was removed, his work assignments did not return. The colleagues he had worked alongside for years treated him, by his own account, as though he had betrayed the institution rather than upheld it. He had not betrayed anything, he had told the truth. The institution found that unacceptable. He eventually left Morton Thiokol. He spent years dealing with severe post-traumatic stress. The weight of knowing months before, knowing the night before, watching it happen and having no power to stop it. That weight did not leave him. In interviews years later, he said that January 28, 1986 had never stopped being January 28, 1986 for him. He spent the remainder of his career speaking at universities and engineering conferences. His subject was always the same: the ethical responsibility of engineers to tell the truth, regardless of institutional pressure. The obligation to be the person in the room who says, "The data indicates this is not safe, and I will not sign my name to a document that claims otherwise." He was trying to teach the next generation of engineers how to be the person he had been, and how to be heard, because he had not been heard and 7 people had died because of it. He died in 2012. His July 1985 memo still exists. It remains part of the public record. It says exactly what he said it said. It is signed, it is dated, 6 months before. A time bomb, he wrote. The language is unambiguous. The language was always unambiguous. Here is what the record shows. The O-ring problem had been documented as early as 1977, 9 years before the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, in internal NASA assessments that identified the joint seal design as a critical safety concern. In the years that followed, the concern was raised, reviewed, partially addressed, and never fully resolved. It was carried forward into each subsequent launch as an accepted risk, a known problem that had not yet caused a catastrophe, and was therefore managed rather than fixed. Managed, not fixed. Managed. Every time a shuttle launched and returned safely with O-ring erosion data in the post-flight analysis, the erosion was documented and the program moved forward. The data was accumulating. The pattern was visible. The relationship between cold temperatures and increased erosion was visible in the numbers. But the numbers had not yet produced a failure, and in the logic of an institution under schedule pressure, the absence of failure was treated as evidence of acceptable risk. Roger boisterously saw the pattern. He named it. He committed it to paper. Nobody acted. The Rogers Commission, in its final report, named the underlying cause of the disaster with unusual directness. It was not the O-ring. The O-ring was the mechanism. The cause was the decision to launch and the decision-making process that produced it. A process in which safety concerns raised by engineers were filtered through management layers that transformed technical objections into schedule inconveniences. A process in which the wrong people held final authority and the right people had been systematically prevented from exercising theirs. The commission found that NASA managers had known about the O-ring problem since 1977, that the joint had been classified as an acceptable risk without adequate justification for that classification, that the culture within NASA and its contractors had created conditions in which it was easier to continue than to stop, easier to accept a known risk than to delay a visible program. They called it a failure of communication. It was more than that. It was the sound of a signal being sent clearly, repeatedly, by people who understood exactly what they were seeing, and being received by people who chose not to act on it. Not because they did not understand it, but because understanding it would have required them to do something costly, difficult, and inconvenient. 7 people died because an institution decided that the cost of delay was higher than the risk of launch. The O-ring knew the temperature. It responded to the physics exactly as the physics dictated. It did not care about the schedule. It did not care about public relations strategy. It did not care about the school children watching on television or the pressure to keep the program moving. It was a rubber seal in cold air. Failed. And everyone who needed to know had been told it would. The temperature at Kennedy Space Center on the morning of January 28, 1986, was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. 7 people climbed into a spacecraft in that temperature. They did not know what had been said the night before. They did not know about the memo from July. They trusted the institution. They trusted the process. They trusted that if something had been genuinely documented, signed, submitted, and clearly wrong, someone would have stopped the count. Someone had tried. Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off at 11:38 a.m. It flew for 73 seconds. It traveled approximately 14 kilometers above the Earth before it came apart. The signal had been sent. Clearly, repeatedly, in writing, on the telephone, across a conference table with photographs as evidence. The signal said, "The cold will break the seal. The seal will fail. People will die." The signal was received. It was ignored. And at 11:38 on a cold Tuesday morning in January, 7 people who had no idea any of this had happened left the ground, trusting that the signal had been heard. It had been heard. It had simply been decided by people sitting in warm rooms, looking at schedules rather than data, that the signal did not matter enough to stop the count. Nature cannot be fooled. It never could. It never will. The signal never disappears. It just waits to be heard. Subscribe to Pale Frequency and stay tuned.